Hello, welcome to CET 4884 Security Methods and Practice. In this session, we will learn how to assess risk based on probability of occurrence and likely impact. We will explain the fundamental aspects of documenting risk via the process of risk assessment. We will describe the various risk mitigation strategy options. We will identify the categories that can be used to classify controls. In addition, we will be also able to recognize the conceptual frameworks for evaluating risk controls and formulate a cost-benefit analysis. In the last session, we addressed the process of identifying the organization assets, the threats, and the vulnerabilities. Once the project team for information security development has created the ranked vulnerabilities worksheet, the team must choose one of four basic strategies to control the risks that result from these vulnerabilities. Of course, that will be supported by the upper management, supported and empowered by the upper management. The four risk strategies guide an organization to first apply safeguards that eliminate or reduce the remaining uncontrolled risks for the vulnerabilities, and that is considered a defense mechanism or strategy, or what we call avoidance. We can also transfer the risk to other areas or to outside entities, and that's called transference, and all of these will be addressed in the next few slides. We will talk more about them. We can reduce the impact that the vulnerability will exploit, and that's called mitigation. We can inform the organization of all the consequences and accept the risk without control or mitigation, and that will be called acceptance. So for the defense or avoidance strategy, this strategy is of course the preferred strategy, as it seeks to avoid risk in its total rather than dealing with it with the fact of hitting after the fact and after it has been realized that there is an attack. This risk control strategy attempts to prevent the realization or exploitation of the vulnerability. Avoidance is accomplished through countering threats, removing vulnerabilities in assets, limiting access to assets, and or adding protective safeguards. The most common methods of avoidance involve three areas of controls avoidance through application of policy, training and education, and of course technology. We can, like we said, transfer the problem to another third party or to another department. So it's a control strategy that attempts to shift the risk to other assets or other processes or other organizations. Could be even outsourcing, like a third party or a contractor. If an organization does not already have quality security management and administration experience, it should hire individuals or firms that can provide such expertise. This allows the organization to transfer the risk associated with the management of these complex systems to another organization with established experience in dealing with the risk. Mitigation is the control strategy that attempts to reduce the impact caused by the exploitation of vulnerability through planning and preparation. This strategy is being implemented after an attack, so already it's been done now. Based on that, it includes three types of plans. We have the disaster recovery planning, which is called DRP. We have the business continuity planning, BCP, and incident response planning, IRP. The mitigation begins with the early detection that an attack is in progress. The most common of the mitigation procedures is the disaster recovery plan, and the disaster recovery plan includes the entire spectrum of activities to recover from an incident, and of course the DRP or the disaster recovery plan can include strategies to limit losses before and during the disaster. The DRPs usually include all preparations for the recovery process, strategies to limit losses during the disaster, and detailed steps to follow when the disaster has ended. The actions and organization can perhaps take or something that they should follow while the incident is in progress should be defined in a document referred to as the incident response plan. And the incident response plan provides answers to questions or to question victims might pose on the midst of the disaster. Those are the questions that the victims will ask. It answers the question, what do I do now? What should the administrators do first? Who should they contact? And what should they document? So all these questions will be answered in the incident response plan. The DRP and the IRP plans or planning overlap to a degree. In many regards, the DRP is the subsection of the IRP that covers disastrous events. While some DRP and IRP decisions and actions are the same, their urgency and results can differ dramatically. The DRP focuses more on preparations completed before and actions taken after the incidents, while the IRP focuses on intelligence gathering, information analysis, coordinated decision making, and urgent concrete actions. The third type of planning under mitigation is the business continuity plan, or BCP. The BCP is the most strategic and long-term plan of the three plans. It encompasses the continuation of business activities if a catastrophic event occurs, such as the loss of the entire database, maybe the building, or even the operations center. So the PCP includes planning for the steps to ensure the continuation of the organization when the scope or scale of the disaster exceeds the DRP's ability to restore operations. The fourth control strategy is acceptance, where an organization evaluates the risk of vulnerability and allows the risky state to continue as is. The only acceptance strategy is recognized as a valid occurrence or occurs when the organization has determined the level of the risk. So we cannot implement the acceptance strategy unless we determine that level of risk. Is it okay to accept? We need also to assess the probability of the attack. What will be the probability of that attack to happen? If that attack happens, then that risk is valid and will happen. We need to estimate the potential damage that could occur from these attacks. We need also to perform a thorough cost-benefit analysis. Do we need to spend money on that risk? So I will not be able to accept it as is without doing some further analysis and answering questions and making sure that I have the level, the probability, the estimated cost, the damage that will occur. We need to evaluate the controls that need to be used. Is it feasible to control it? We need to decide that the particular function or service or information or asset did not or can be justified with the cost to be protected. If they are justified to be protected, then we need to take an action. We cannot accept it. So all these are questions or areas that need to be addressed first before we apply the acceptance strategy. The acceptance of the risk is the choice to do nothing, to protect a vulnerability and to accept the outcome of its exploitation. That's why we need to make sure that we are doing the correct thing by accepting the risk. This control, or actually let's say its lack of control, is based on the assumption that it may be a prudent business decision to examine the alternatives and determine that the cost protecting an asset does not justify the security expenditure. The term risk appetite is used to describe the degree to which an organization is willing to accept risk as a trade-off to the expense of applying controls. The terminate control strategy directs the organization to avoid those business activities that introduce uncontrollable risks. So if the activity considered a risky activity, then just eliminate or terminate that activity. If we eliminate, now, are we affecting the company's operation? Are we affecting the requirement to meet customer needs? If this is the case, then we have to find alternative activities that will replace the uncontrollable activities and will meet customer needs at that point. So we cannot terminate activities without having alternative activities if they do affect company's operation. The level of threat and value of the asset should play a major role in the selection of strategy. So the following rules of thumb can be applied in selecting the preferred strategy. First, when a vulnerability exists, implement assurance techniques to reduce the likelihood of a vulnerability being exercised. When a vulnerability can be exploited, apply layered protection architecture designs and administrative controls to minimize the risk or prevent these occurrence. When the attacker's cost is less than his or her potential gain, apply protections to increase the attacker's cost. Use system control to limit what a system user can access and do thereby significantly reducing an attacker's gain. When potential loss is substantial, apply design principles, architectural designs, and technical and non-technical protections to limit the extent of the attack, thereby reducing the potential for loss. This figure shows the process of risk handling and decision making points. Before deciding on the strategy for a specific vulnerability, all information about the economic and non-economic consequences of the vulnerability facing the information asset must be explored and studied. The feasibility study will ask questions about the possible implementation of the controls, including the advantages and cost, comparing that to the cost and results of not implementing these controls. In addition, we will have the disadvantages of these controls. The cost-benefit analysis is an economic feasibility study of implementation. It's a feasibility of implementation approach or study that commonly considered for a project or information security controls and safeguards. The organization begins by evaluating the worth of the information assets to be protected and the loss in value if those information assets are compromised by the specific vulnerability. It's only common sense that an organization should not spend more to protect an asset more than it's worth, of course. So we have to. That's why we need to evaluate the cost of that asset and justify the expenditure of money to protect it or to apply controls. Some of the factors that impact the cost of a control or safeguard include the cost of development or acquisition, the training fees, cost of implementation, service costs, and cost of maintenance after the implementation. Once an organization has estimated the worth of various assets, it can begin to examine the potential loss that could occur from the exploitation of the vulnerability or a threat occurrence. This process results in the estimate of potential loss per risk. The questions that must be asked here include what damage could occur and what financial impact would it have. What would it cost to recover from the attack in addition to the cost from the previous question? And then what is the single loss expectancy for each risk? In its simplest definition, the cost-benefit analysis is whether or not the control alternative being evaluated is worth the associated cost incurred to control the specific vulnerability. While many cost-benefit analysis techniques exist for our purposes or for our use here, the CBA is most easily calculated using the ALAE from earlier assessments. So we are going to find the annualized loss expectancy. We call it ALE, annualized loss expectancy, from previous year or prior, and we have the post ELEs, which we examined after the control has been in place for a period of time, and then we can also calculate or take into account the annual cost of the safeguard itself. So the cost analysis will be how much did I spend before, then how much after, and how much did I pay for the safeguard. Now if the cost in positive, then I'm fine. If the cost in negative, then we're not fine. We cannot justify the expenditure of the money on that vulnerability. So it has to be positive to justify applying the controls. Once the controls in place, they must be monitored and re-evaluated to determine the effectiveness of the implementation. In addition, the estimated residual risk must be calculated accurately to adjust existing controls or to apply new controls. The process of re-evaluation continues in a loop as long as the organization in business. This figure shows the risk control cycle and the re-evaluation process to adjust controls or to apply new controls. The quantitative risk analysis perform risk, probability, and impact assessment, probability investigation or likelihood that the risk will occur, while impact investigates the potential effect on the organization information system using actual values or estimates. So with quantitative, we are using actual values or actual estimates, and we are looking at the probability, the likelihood to happen, and the impact of that risk or the impact of that vulnerability when it happens. Then a probability and impact matrix is used to prioritize risk for further quantitative analysis and response based on their ranking. That will be followed with risk categorization, where the risk can be categorized based on the source of that risk. while in the qualitative risk analysis, the steps will be completed using non-numerical measures that might not provide the accurate assessment needed. Benchmarking is an alternative strategy to the cost-benefit analysis, which approaches risk management from a different angle. Instead of determining the financial values of information and then implementing security as an acceptable percentage of the value, an organization could look at peer institutions to determine what others are doing to protect their information systems. And that's called benchmarking. So benchmarking is the process of seeking out and studying the practices used in other organizations that produce the results that the organization desires or that the company desires on their information system. So when benchmarking, an organization typically uses one of two measures to compare practices to determine which practice it would prefer to implement. The first set of measures are metrics based, and the second set of measures are process based measures. For the metrics based measures, it's comparison or comparisons based on numerical standards such as numbers of successful attacks, the staff hours spent on system protection, the dollars spent on protection, numbers of security personnel, estimated losses in dollars of information due to successful attacks, loss in productivity hours associated with successful attacks. An organization uses this information by ranking competitive businesses within a similar size or market and determining how their measures compare to others. The process-based measures are generally less number-focused and more strategic than metrics-based measures. For each of the areas the organization is interested in benchmarking, process-based measures enable the companies to examine the activities an individual company performs in pursuit of its goal. So we are looking at the processes within the company rather than the specific of how goals were attained. The primary focus is the method the organization uses to accomplish a particular process rather than the outcome. In information security, two categories of benchmarks are used: standards of due care, due diligence, and best practices. Within best practices is a subcategory of practices referred to as the gold standard. Those practices typically viewed as the best of the best. When organizations adopt levels of security for a legal defense, they may need to show that they have done what any practical organization would do in similar circumstances. This is referred to as the standard of due care. It's insufficient to just implement these standards and then ignore them after that. The application of controls at or above the prescribed levels and the maintenance of those standards of due care show that the organization has performed what's called due diligence. So it's not just putting the controls and forgetting about them. It's putting the controls, monitoring, re-evaluating, and making sure that they are maintained frequently so it will continue providing the proper protection needed. And that's what's called due diligence. In other words, due diligence is the demonstration that the organization is diligent in ensuring that the implemented standards continue to provide the required level of protection. Now, failure to support a standard of due care or due diligence can open an organization to legal liability. They are not doing their job. They are not protecting their information system. Especially, customers can, complain about that. So, provided it can be shown that the organization was negligent in its application or lack of application of information protection, which again can create lawsuits for the company and can affect company's reputation. Security efforts that seek to provide a superior level of performance in the protection of information are referred to as best business practices, or simply best practices or recommended practices. The best security practices are those security efforts that are among the best in the industry, balancing the need to access with the need to provide adequate protection. Best practices seek to provide as much security as possible for information and systems while maintaining a solid degree of responsibility. When considering best practices for adoption in your organization, consider the following. Does your organization resemble the identified target organization of the best practice? And are the resources you can expend similar to those identified in the best practices? Do you have the resources needed? A best practice proposal that assumes unlimited funding and does not identify needed trade-offs will be of limited value if the approach has strict resource limits. That will not work for the organization. Are you in a similar threat environment as that proposed in the best practice? That's another question that you have to ask. Are we the same? Are we facing the same problems? Again, a proposal of best practice from months and even weeks ago may not be appropriate for the current threat environment and may not show the accurate level of threat that you have in the organization. So we must ask questions before we implement the best practices coming from another company or another organization. We have to look at our company compared to their company and make sure that it applies to the organization. The biggest problem with benchmarking in information security is that organizations do not talk to each other. They will not give you all the information needed, and they will not, of course, reveal their vulnerabilities or threats for you. Another problem with benchmarking is that no two organizations are identical. Whatever the product is, even if they produce the similar or the same product, still they might do all their processes differently, and they have different policies, different rules, different layout. So it's not identical, and we need to make sure when implementing that it applies for our company. A third problem is that best practices are a moving target. When we say best practices for now, it will be old for next year and so on. So every year I'm looking for the best practice for that one. So I have to keep on moving my target to reach the best practice. So what worked well 2 years ago may be completely worthless against today's threats. And by the time you analyze best practices and implement them, threats will be different. So we have to continue on looking at those problems or those threats and compare them before we implement anything and call it best practice. One last issue to consider is that simply knowing what was going on a few years ago as in benchmarking does not necessarily tell us what to do next. Baselining is the analysis of measures against established standards. So we can establish a baseline, and that baseline will be my standard of comparison, and I can start from there. In information security, baselining is having a baseline of security activities and events that can be compared to the organization's future performance and see if I'm improving, or am I increasing security, am I reducing risk, or not. And that will be the baseline for me. So when baselining, it's useful to have a guide to the overall process. We need like a procedure or a guide or something documented that will keep that baseline, or make sure that we are setting a standard or a baseline, the proper baseline for the company. In addition to the cost-benefit analysis and the best practices, there are other feasibility studies that can be used to assess security alternatives for the organization. For example, we have organizational feasibility study, which examines how well the proposed information security alternatives will contribute to the efficiency, effectiveness, and overall operation of an organization. It's above and beyond the impact on the bottom line. The organization must determine how the proposed alternatives contribute to the business objectives of the organization. We have also the operational feasibility study, which examines user and management acceptance and support and the overall requirements of the organization stakeholders. We have also the technical feasibility study, which examines if the organization has or can acquire the technology necessary to implement and support the control alternatives. And last, the political feasibility study, which defines what can or can't occur based on consensus and relationships. It's very important to document security alternatives analysis and security measures and controls implementations, and mostly to document the results of the implementation. Documenting the outcome of a control strategy will assist in the continuous analysis and in adjusting or changing these controls to a better or more efficient controls. The asset threat pairing with the implemented control can be documented as an action plan that has specific tasks with assigned accountability to a unit or individual. By doing this, then we will know who's responsible for that pair of asset threat with the controls, and they will be the one to adjust or update or make sure that there are no vulnerabilities in the system. By finishing this, or by doing this, actually we finished the risk management processes with all these strategies, with the way that we deal with risk and the vulnerabilities on the system for information security. If you have any questions on that, please use any of the channels provided to communicate with me for your question. That will be all for this session. Thank you and have a great day.